So as a producer, there is nothing scarier than the thought of opening your DAW and wondering what is next. What's up everyone, I'm Aiden from EDM Prod, and today I'm going to be sharing with you 7 different ways that you can get the most out of your sessions so that you can break through those times where you're feeling a little bit hesitant to jump into the studio and make music that you want to be making. But before we do, just make sure that you stick around for all of these tips because I think all 7 of these work together really well in harmony. Great, let's start with the first tip here, and it's one of my favorite things to do as a producer, and it's to prepare beforehand with a ritual. Now we're actually going to jump out of the door here because it's important that before we open our DAW that we are ready, in a good mind frame, and that we're wanting to make music. The problem is most people just jump into the DAW willy-nilly and think that you can just start banging out beats really quickly. But the problem is these sessions may get easily interrupted by things like social media, people in the house you're living in, or other factors beyond your control. Now, these rituals can be helped if you're doing music production regularly. They're easier to do, so if you're not already scheduling out a regular time every day or every certain number of times a week to do music production, then you might find this a little bit harder to implement. The point here is not to overcomplicate it, but to keep it simple. You might want to start off your production sessions by doing something like making a tea or a coffee. You might want to let the people know around you that you're making music for the next however long. You may want to even close all the windows so you don't get outside noise, etc. Close anything on your computer that doesn't need to be there that could distract you, etc. Now, if this is sounding a little too confusing for you, what can help is if you just write it down. So I'm just got my note-taking app here, and I'm just going to write down a little example ritual that I use when I'm getting into my music production, so I'm prepared for the session. So the first thing I might do is make a coffee. The second thing I might do is alert my wife because she might want to know if I'm not around for the next 2 hours or 3 hours or however long I'm making music for. The third thing I might want to do is close all internet browsers and disable let's spell that right. Disable notifications. And that could be my simple 3 things that I do before I get into every music production session. 3 is really easy to remember. I don't even have to refer to this in the end then, and it easily becomes a habit. And this is just going to much better prepare you for those sessions without having to worry about what's going to happen halfway through. Okay, tip number 2 is to have your resources ready to go in your host DAW. Now, I've got my default Ableton template here, which I'll get into in a second. But what really helps here is to have everything ready to go before you start making music. So it helps to do a few sessions before, in between other normal music production sessions, just to get your favorite samples, plugins, presets, and even your template organized and ready to go so that when you're ready to make music, you don't have to worry about setting these things up every time. For example, I have my samples up in the top left here in different collections in Ableton. This just allows me to find different sample types out of all the packs I've got installed on my computer very easily without having to scroll through thousands and thousands of sample libraries. I have my favorite samples otherwise categorized down here in the places. I've also got my favorite preset in instrument racks here in Ableton in different folders, so my favorite ones are always ready to go there. I've also got my favorite plugins curated in this collections here, but I've also organize them into different folders within my plugins branch here in my browser, so I can always see which plugins are where. And lastly, I've set up my template here with my favorite groupings, colorings, and other processing that I would apply on my master bus when I'm making music. Now, the point here is, once again, not to overcomplicate it. And the point is to still leave room for creativity without, getting rid of the boring work that's kind of getting in the way of that, right? So setting up grouping, setting up your tracks that you know you're going to use every single time. What I would avoid against potentially, and this does depend on the person who's doing it, is loading up lots of plugins like instruments and synths and samples into the sessions, because they can otherwise just clog up your sessions with extra CPU usage because you might not necessarily use that every time. However, if you just create a blank clip for it, you know you're going to load up whatever synth or instrument you're feeling like using for that particular session onto that track. So there's a balance of too much and too little when you're setting up your template. But doing this really helps you just to be prepared and not to be overwhelmed by the number of options. Which leads me on to my third point for this video, which is adding in limitations. I think limitations are a great way to work in your DAW because creativity is at its best when you have constraints going on. What I mean by that is there's so many options you can be doing as a music producer that it can be overwhelming. So having some sort of constraints, whether that's the options you've got for plugins or samples, or some sort of idea or thought experiment that you can try. For example, you could try some random idea for a production session and see how it goes. And what I mean by that is something like a different idea, like you could make your track out of one sample or use only one synth for the whole track, or perhaps find a random sound that you never otherwise would have used and try and work that into your track. This way you're limiting yourself creatively, but the point here isn't to think of these ideas that you come up with as lesser, because often what we do is we might try and experiment as a producer and then say, oh, it can't be as good as if I made just a quote unquote normal track. But honestly, coming up with these creative ideas for working is honestly how some of the best ideas are made from my personal experience, and I know many other producers would also agree with me in saying that. So that could be something as simple as, let's find one sample just to work with and drag it in and see how we go. So if I found this harp sample, right, I might drag that into my audio track. And now perhaps I have to make all the musical elements out of this harp sound. So I might find a little snippet here. And I could make my bass out of this sample simply by dragging this onto a bass track. And we could low pass it. Do that there. And the point is there, you would use these different elements to make new sounds, etc. This is just one of many creative ideas you could use, and just see how you get different results. It doesn't have to be as specific or as limited as what I've just shown you, but it just goes to show that doing different things can yield different creative results. Okay, number 4 is to set goals but reduce your expectations. Now, having goals in your music production sessions are great, and they can point you in the right direction if you're wanting to achieve a specific goal. For example, finishing a song in a certain session or doing the mix down at least. The problem is that producers often mix up goals with expectations. What I mean by that is that goals help point you in a certain direction, but they're a signpost. Expectations mean that if you don't meet that certain level, then you're considered a failure. What I do personally is I set a goal for a session, but I'll have an expectation of only just working on music for that session. So for example, I'm happy if I just open the DAW for a little bit. Even though I have this goal of, say, wanting to do a mix down, I'm not going to get mad at myself if I go on another tangent or try something else, or just don't even do it as long as I originally wanted to. The point is that I made music and I can just be happy with that. So reduce your expectations for the sessions so that you can free up your mental ability to just focus on whatever's important and just to enjoy the process. I think one thing that really burns a lot of producers out is this idea that every session has to have this super productive output and we have to make the best song ever. That's just not realistic. The point here is just to enjoy the process, to have goals, but not measure our success based on whether we achieve them every single time or not. Whether you produce for 5 minutes or 5 hours every day, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter. The point is that you worked on music and that you're heading in a general direction that you want to be. For example, I have my music production calendar blocked out to work on music about an hour to an hour and a half every morning where I can possible. Now, often this is not the full hour and a half because it's allowing some buffer room in there to switch over and get ready for the work for the rest of the day. But the point here is that I work on music for a consistent amount of time every time. And I can change it up where I need to, of course, but it just allows me to have the ability to say, I'm going to open the door this morning and do something. I might have an idea of what that wants to be, but if I do that or not at the end of the day, it doesn't matter. Okay, number 5 is to use a notepad. Now, I have a little notebook here that's physically on my table quite often when I'm producing sessions. This is just some pen and paper so I can write ideas down really quickly while I'm working on music. And the reason I have a notebook in the studio is because I like the ability of when I'm working on a specific idea in my song, if I have another creative idea, I can write it down instead of pursuing it just then, because often what happens is I might be, for example, working on a lead sound and I'm changing the MIDI and the notes that are being played, but I have this idea to automate the reverb on a send for this lead. Now's not the time to be doing it, so what I'll do is I'll quickly write it down on my piece of paper, and that way I can come back to it at a later time where I've got a bit more mental ability to start focusing on that. This is good because it helps you to not forget good ideas, but also keeps you focused on what you're doing already, because if we're jumping around too much, we can lose our workflow. That being said though, for shorter tasks like, deleting a track, or so for example, quickly adding an EQ to this harp sound is a much quicker thing that I can just quickly do there, and I don't have to write it down. If the task takes less than half a minute, say, just do it. But if it's going to be something longer that you need to explore, write it down. It's just helpful to have a notepad in the studio for ideas constantly going, and I don't think there's any harm in doing it. So I'd highly recommend you do that so you get the most out of your studio sessions. Okay, number 6 is one of my favorites, and this was one that really helped me increase my workflow speed, become a better producer overall. And it's to learn the shortcuts in your DAW. The reason I really recommend doing this is because clicking with your mouse is just super cumbersome, and it doesn't really need to happen for a lot of the things we do day to day. Learning keyboard shortcuts instead can be a great way to speed up your workflow, and you can even go as far as creating your own keyboard shortcuts, which I'll demonstrate in a second. But for example, with this harp sound, let's go back here. Let's bring it over here. Say I wanted to chop some of these elements out of the harp sound. Now I could right click, find the thing I want to do, go split. I could right click here, go split, change these around, and then I could select each of them, and then I'd have to right click and go consolidate, for example. Now that's one way of doing that, but instead what I can do is use shortcuts to achieve the same thing, which on a Mac in Ableton would be Command-E, Command-E, click, drag, shift, click, and Command-J to consolidate, which is a way faster way of working. Then I can duplicate it really fast with Command-D, and then I can insert time in between the clips, Command-I, 16 bars, for example. And there we go, we've got a new phrase. Really quickly chopped up, consolidated, duplicated, and it didn't take that many clicks at all. So this is just a great way to do that. Another cool thing, as I mentioned before, is that you can make your own. So for example, I have my limiter here on Ableton, but I don't want it on by default because I want to be mixing without hearing it going into a limiter most of the time. However, I do want to see what it's going to sound like when I add 6 dB of gain into my limiter. So what I'm going to do here is flick it on with a keyboard shortcut. In this case, I'm using the tilde. If you press Command K in Ableton specifically, you can see that the tilde, or the backwards apostrophe, I think it's called, is mapped to the on-off switch of my limiter here. I'm sure you can do this in your host DAW as well if you wish to. And as you can see here, as I press it, it turns on, and subsequently, we'll add a little bit more volume, as you can hear there. Okay, so number 7, this is one thing I like to do at the end of my sessions once I've worked on a tune. I've got a little idea here that I've been working on, so I can demonstrate this to you. You get the point there. What I want to do though is I've finished working on this tune. It's a little 32 bar loop for now. We've started kind of arranging it into an idea bar. I'm done for this session. Now, as you can see, a few things are already color coded, which is nice. That's mostly due to my work beforehand in setting up groups and that kind of thing. But there's still a bit of messy stuff going on here. Not everything is named the best it could be. We've got elements that aren't being used at the moment that we could clean up. So what I want to do is just cool down, prepare this session for the next time I'm going to work on it, and then we can move on to whatever's next. So a few things I'm going to do here is name things correctly. So I'm going to name this break 2 instead of the default sample name. I'm going to name these according to the sound. That's like a little wobble perk. I'm going to call this one Amen break chops, because it's just a little loop there that's chopped up. And then I'm going to call this resonant hat. Awesome. I've got an extra audio clip I can delete because I don't need that. Bass is pretty self-explanatory. But I could call it like a crunchy wobble sub. So I kind of know what kind of bass it is. Up to you if you want to do that or just leave it as bass. Not using a vocal, although I did end up using one, but kind of in a different workflow. So I didn't use my default vocal channel, which is fine. I can delete that. I've got a track here, which I haven't used, and I'm not sure if I'm going to. So what I'm going to do for now is color this black. Call it old vocal chops. They sound like this. And they weren't used in this version, so I'm going to actually just bring them down to the bottom of my session for now, because I'm not sure if I'm going to use them yet. I've got this here as well, which I think could go into this group here, which perhaps actually already has the shimmer on it. So maybe I'll leave this one outside of the group and call this ambient vocal. I'm going to call this the vocal group, and I'm going to call these just different chops because each one of these tracks is a different chop. So I'm going to call this chop 1. I'm going to call this chop 2, and I'm going to call this chop 3. That's a bit better organized now. Even though this isn't in that group at the moment, they're still color-coded, coordinated accordingly. So we know that they're belonging to the same set of instruments or sounds in the mix. Lastly, we've got the the music bus, which is just a few different sounds that I can rename because they're just called sample for now. This one can be deleted because it's not being used. And this one I'm just going to call black. And I'm going to also put him down the bottom here. Just call it toy piano run. Assign that to our clips. And this one I'm going to call, based on the sound of it, I'm going to call this synth soul pad. That's the kind of vibe I'm getting from this. This is a little kind of wispy, airy synth. I'm going to call this bright phase lead. And now that kind of describes to me what this sound is. So this session is pretty much cleaned up for now. There's a few other things I could do, just double check what's going on in the master. Okay, that's cool. And then maybe I'll just add a limiter on since I didn't have this in the original session because my template wasn't set up correctly then. Perhaps I'm just going to put one on at 0. And now what I can do is simply just bounce this out into my project folder. And the reason I like to do this is because I can hear the version I've worked on most recently without having to actually go in and open it up. So let me just save this in the right place. All right, and this is called Palatial Structures, which I named previously. I'm going to call this V1 because that's version 1 that I've exported. Then we just wait for the export to finish. And that way we've always got that there to listen to whenever we go back and look in that project without opening Ableton. Great, so I hope you've seen from start to finish how you can get the most out of your production session with these different tips. Whether it's preparing beforehand or cooling down afterwards, or just learning things that you can do in the middle of your studio sessions, I hope that you can implement some of these. But if you have any questions about the things I've taught you today, let me know down in the comments and we'll get back to you and help you out. Lastly, if this video was helpful, make sure to give it a like. Gentle like push, don't have to smash it, don't have to make it too crazy, just like the like button if you thought it was good, and subscribe for more content from the EDM Prod team. Also, there's a bunch of free downloads on our website, from PDF guides to tools to resources to samples, so go check that out in the description as well. Apart from that, I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.